Genesis chapter 20. When I had just thought that this was going to be a two-parter, I had named it Family Values Part 1 and Part 2. But since I took last week's lesson as kind of a distinct unit, I dropped Part 2 and I just wrote what again? Because this story should have more than echoes. It should sound fairly familiar. And we'll talk more about why that is in a second. But first, so let's start with the text. This is Genesis chapter 20, verse 1. From there, Abraham journeyed toward the region of the Negev and settled between Kadesh and Shur. While residing in Gerar as an alien, Abraham said of his wife, Sarah, "She is my sister." And King Abimelech of Gerar sent and took Sarah. Now, King Abimelech is the king of the Canaanites. And if this text sounds familiar, it should. Back in Genesis chapter 12, we read about how Abram lied about Sarai's relationship to him and allowed her to be taken into the house of the Pharaoh in Egypt. There are differences. The most noticeable difference is the dialogue between God and Abimelech, this back and forth in the dream that the king Abimelech has with God in this story. Whilst in the Egyptian account, the whole house of the Pharaoh got very sick with the plague, and that was what caught his attention. And God is not, the voice of God is not echoed in that story. The story in chapter 12 is from the Yahwist source, the J source, and scholars assign the material in chapter 20 to the Elohist source for not only its use of the word God instead of Yahweh, Elohim, just the generic Elohim, but also the theme of God coming in dreams. Later in the story of Jacob, we'll have him having similar dreams from Elohist material. And then during the account of Joseph, where you have Joseph having dreams and the Pharaoh having dreams, it's no coincidence that the foreign king in the Joseph story has a dream that shows him a divine revelation. And similar here, we have the foreign king having a dream sent by God to have a divine revelation. It's because they're from, it's all Elohist material. Scholars think, and I can only take their word for it, but I'm reasonably convinced. Are we to think of these two versions of the same story set in different contexts, or are we to think of these as mythic memories of two separate occurrences? In my opinion, based on the way that the narrative has been woven together in Genesis' final form, I think that the reader of the Torah in its final version is meant to think that Abraham has pawned Sarah out yet again, not having learned the right lessons the first time in Egypt. Poor Sarah. And I might add, the lesson that Abram learned in Egypt was that you do this and you get a whole lot of stuff when you're kicked out of the country. So he really didn't take it hard on the nose the last time. So I'm not really surprised from his behavior in this story. But here we get into it. Verse 3. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, "You are about to die because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a married woman." Now Abimelech had not approached her. So he said, "Lord, will you destroy an innocent people? Did he not himself say to me, 'She is my sister'? And she herself said, 'He is my brother'? I did this in the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands." Fritham, the quote's in the middle of this, sorry. The severity of the consequences Abimelech faces stick out to me from the onset. You are about to die. Different than what happened to the Pharaoh in his household, his people, they were just cursed with the plague. The consequences are you are going to die. And this is one story in the Bible where the moral order seems to hum along in the background like clockwork. And what I mean is this: certain actions in this world that we're reading about here seem to carry with them certain divine judgments, irregardless of motive. The moral order, Fritham writes, means that certain deeds have an effect just by virtue of them having happened. And people reap the consequences quite apart from their intentions or their knowledge of what they have done. This story plays like other stories where some hapless soul unknowingly breaks some rule that they maybe didn't know about and is therefore cursed by the gods. You break the divine law and then you pay the price regardless of your knowledge of the rules or your intentions. Personally, I want to say that intentions and innocence do matter. I think practically this plays out in parenting. If my kids meant to do what they did, it means something different than if it was an accident. For example, yesterday, June was swinging a block and clocked Abel in the head. And there was no divine law that said, the parental law that said, you shall not hit your brother under any circumstance. And the penalty is timeout. It was like, okay, this was clearly something that was regrettable, but not necessarily June wasn't culpable in the same way. I kind of see the situation in the same light. But nonetheless, the consequences for Abimelech will be death. So I feel like this is a bit unfair. And so it does apparently Abimelech, for he pleads his case before God. He says, did he not himself say to me, she is my sister? And then also pointed out that Sarah corroborated the story. Also, it helps in his case because he has not yet, quote unquote, approached her. Wonder what that means. Verse 6. Then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know that you did this in the integrity of your heart. So God has foreknowledge that Abimelech did not intentionally do anything wrong here. Goes on. Furthermore, it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. Now then, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not restore her, know that you shall surely die, and all that are yours. I have right here, as was true last weekend, perfectly accurate rendering of these events as they happen in the picture.
Yeah, right.
You never know what you're going to find when you look for these pictures. So God knows the heart of Abimelech, which is why God intervenes. Abimelech's dream is a divine act of mercy, and we'll see similar dreams in the story of Joseph and his time in Egypt, as I said previously. God prevents Abimelech from breaking the moral order, something he almost did in ignorance. The God we meet in this story cares about justice and fairness. You may have this moral order playing on in the background with consequences just because, or in spite of intentions, but God still cares in the story about justice and fairness, and thus prevents a great tragedy from falling on the house of Abimelech. And we discover later in verses 17 and 18 that God has managed this by way of giving Abimelech and his entire house a disease which prevented them from having children. Personally, I find this idea of God preventing someone from sinning as a bit of a double-edged sword. On my personal opinion here, on one hand, I appreciate that God has acted to prevent an evil act carried out by an innocent man with no evil intentions. On the other hand, if God can prevent sin in this instance, why not prevent sin at every turn and people from doing things that they wouldn't otherwise want to do, especially sins of ignorance? Now, also note before we move on, Abraham is called a prophet. This is the first such designation in the Bible. A prophet is a conduit of God's divine will, intentions, and even intercedes to bring into effect God's actions in the world. That is how we will see prophets playing out as we get into later prophets like Samuel and Elijah and Elisha, and in the books of the prophets. This is their role as intercessors who bring about God's actions and name God's will and intentions, and judgment sometimes too. Abraham's designation as such seems to have nothing to do with his own righteousness, and I don't think it ever did. Abimelech finds himself in the awkward position of needing Abraham to restore his future. Abraham, the very man who put him in this unfortunate position in the first place. And so the curse was brought into his house by this man, and now he has to turn to this man and ask for a prayer for healing. A bit of an awkward position, I would think, to find oneself in. But he takes it graciously, as we will read here in a second. Verse 8. So Abimelech rose early in the morning and called all his servants and told them all these things, and the men were very much afraid. When Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, "What have you done to us? How have I sinned against you that you have brought such great guilt on me and my kingdom? You have done things to me which ought not to be done. This is the only time we have judgment thrown at Abraham, aspersions, or any kind of condemnation of Abraham's actions here. It doesn't come from God. It comes from Abimelech. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what were you thinking of when you did this thing? So Abimelech catches everyone up to speed first, and then goes to confront Abraham. And I want to call your attention to the way that Abimelech frames what has happened. What have you done to us? Now, it's his action to bring her into his harem, but he names it as a corporate crime, or at least a crime that has corporate consequences. The almost transgression of Abimelech has affected the entire clan. This is a different way of thinking when compared to our own culture and time, where wrongful acts are often framed in terms of individual transgressions that only impact the one or the ones who transgress. And so we have private prayer closets, we have individual acts of confession, and some people will even say it's just between you and God. And in this story, the consequences of the wrongful or unjust acts are nearly always shared, or in this story, they are shared with the community at large. And I want to say that I think that most wrongful or unjust acts will have this ripple effect. They will either impact one's children, one's friends, one's spouse, one's community in some way. I don't think that individual acts of wrongdoing stay with us. At least not very many of them do. And what we do as individuals has an impact on the entire network of persons with whom we live life with. So even things that you can keep hidden from those that you love will shape you, even in the internalizing of the secret keeping, and impact your behavior in other ways that might have adverse effects. You could think of any number of ways in which what we do impacts those around us. And I believe that sometimes the unseen impact of our actions that the unseen impact our actions have on others should always be a consideration, especially in the context of a global pandemic. And I already basically said this next part earlier at the beginning of the lesson, but the difference here is Abimelech's actions seem to have an impact on the community by way of a divine moral law and the consequences that kick into effect just because that's the way it is. Whilst the consequences of a populace during a pandemic operate not by divine fiat, but by a domino chain of cause and effect. So there is that difference. So here we get to a part that I found myself kind of laughing, leaving the room and talking to Kelly about what I was discovering, because I found it just somewhat unbelievable that Abraham would make the defense that he makes. But in the next verses, we have Abraham's response to Abimelech's "what were you thinking" question. And he gets defensive. Abraham said, I did it because I thought there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother. And she became my wife. And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, this is the kindness you must do me. At every place to which we come, say to me, he is my brother. So this is his defense. He's ready for it. And he does not seem to feel sorry about what he's done at all. And here are his excuses. First, he says that because he had predetermined that there is no fear of God at all in this place, his words, that legitimizes his actions. In other words, he's saying that these are like the people that he found back in places like Sodom. And it's ironic because in this story, Abraham's actions are the ones that most model the behaviors of Sodom, duplicitous, deceptive, and the one who has the conversation with God in the story is the foreign king. The one who God determines is innocent is the foreign king. And so he's just dead wrong on that first assumption that he made from the onset. Second defense is he makes the claim that he wasn't technically lying. We discover in this story that Sarah is Abraham's half-sister. So whilst this does not seem to be a problem within the moral framework of this story, this sort of marriage is later prohibited in Deuteronomy 27, verse 22. And then the third excuse is the doozy, and you read it right. His third argument is basically, God forced me into this, and I was forthright with Sarah and told her it may come to this. That's what he says, that when God caused me, verse 13, to wander from my father's house, when God caused me, I said to her, this is the kindness. And that word kindness there is hesed, which is like the same word that is used to describe God's kindness to us, as in loving kindness. It's a very grace-filled word. And he says to Sarah, This is the kindness you must do to me, the way you must be a blessing to me. At every place to which we come, say of me, he is my brother. And of course she does this. So that's his defense. And I got to say, I see very little evidence of introspection or humility on Abraham's part in this story. The good guy seems to be at every turn Abimelech. And we'll have more on that in a little bit. So the story's winding down. Then Abimelech took sheep and oxen and male and female slaves and gave them to Abraham and restored his wife Sarah to him. Abimelech said, my land is before you. Settle where it pleases you. To Sarah, he said, look, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It is your exoneration before all who are with you. You are completely vindicated. So these actions reveal more concerning Abimelech's character and virtue than about Abraham's worthiness to receive such a blessing. Fritham writes, given the defensiveness of Abraham's reply, Abimelech's response seems magnanimous indeed. He not only restores Sarah, he gives Abraham a significant sum of money for the purpose of vindicating her within her family, literally a covering of the eyes, a public demonstration that she has not been wronged and hence can be held in honor within her community. Abimelech shows far more care for Sarah's honor and place in her own house than does Abraham. Pretty strange actions for a man who lives in a land which there, in Abraham's words, there is no fear of God at all. Turns out the foreigner and the unchosen pagan cares about right living more than the chosen prophet Abraham. And then the story concludes. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, and also healed his wife and female slaves so that they bore children. For the Lord had closed fast all the wounds of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. And I find this scene almost cringeworthy. I don't like the fact that Abimelech's healing and restoration of his house hinges on the actions of a man who has dealt so unfairly with him. But we will see this again and again as a theme amongst God's chosen people. You may think of King David, who in one breath is called a man after God's heart, or a man that God really loves. And then other times he does really terrible things. It's just funny how God's chosen can behave. So apparently Abraham's ability to channel grace has nothing to do with his own moral rectitude. His giftings are pure grace and undeserved. So on one hand, I like the idea that a prophet's calling and abilities are not earned and are therefore gifts from God bestowed on undeserving persons. This personally gives me hope because I often feel like an undeserving and I feel like a person who is more receiving the grace and trying to tell others about it than somebody who climbed my way to a position of authority. And I find that humbling and personally, in some ways, comforting, as long as I don't get too having trouble with the word deprecative. As long as I'm not too hard on myself. Thank you. On the other hand, judging from this story alone, it just seems arbitrary. Why does Abraham still get the ability to speak healing into Abimelech's wife, the man that he has just deceived and brought all this trouble into his life? And yet, as I keep saying, who was a better representative of God's desires and ways in the story? The question borders on rhetorical. Of course, it was Abimelech. So some takeaways. The outsider from the wrong tribe and the wrong religion seems to have a better understanding of God's desires and is better motivated to live rightly. This should serve as a lesson to any person of whatever faith that thinks that their in-group, nation, or religious community holds a monopoly on righteousness, the sole proprietors of the moral high ground. Fritham writes, the reader finds goodness and a keen sense of justice among the outsiders. In fact, the Canaanite king stands in as the example of what to do. The Canaanite king dreams a conversation with God, with the God of Abraham. This more than alludes to the fact that Abimelech is being directed by the God of all peoples towards righteousness. Abraham is not the only conduit for the divine. In fact, in this story, he is a very poor conduit. It is Abimelech who hears the voice of God. Fritham writes, the narrator, of course, understands this voice as that of the God of Abraham. Through the ages, non-chosen people often have had a profound sense of justice and truth, and they have often been teachers of the community of faith regarding such matters. The text functions with a sense of natural law as a part of the created order of things that can be discerned and observed apart from faith. All of this causes me to wonder, me, Heath Jones, what is the difference between the chosen and the alleged non-chosen peoples? I want to bring up again the communal impact of Abimelech's actions. While I do not believe that a person can become magically cursed because of another's actions, we do witness today how actions of individuals have sweeping impacts on us all. We live lives intertwined in a complex network of countless individuals. We do not bear alone the consequences for the mistakes, errors in judgment, and overt acts of evil we commit. King David was wrong when he said to God, "Against you alone have I sinned." One wants to interject, what about Bathsheba and Uriah? When I was convicted of stealing and pirating music, I first began to, by convicted, I mean like not like by the law, but my own inner conscience, I should clarify. I did not go to jail for stealing or pirating online music, but I used to download music illegally. And this was my gateway into understanding the impact of my sin on other people. Because I used to argue with my friends about the morality of it, saying I'm not really hurting anybody. These big companies make all kinds of money, and they they can stand to give this poor college kid some free music, and actually mostly audiobooks and other things like that. I found ways of procuring for free, until one day I was watching the credits of a movie and I realized that every product that I was ripping off digitally had a vast array of persons who put together that piece of art, from the people who created the artwork for the packaging, from the people who packaged it, from the people who were minor sound editors, from the people who gaffed the cables and the tape. And I realized that I was impacting, through my stealing, a network of persons, not to mention the fact that every other person in our country pays more because music is stolen, because they have to up the prices in the stores. My point of bringing up that story is that was the first time I can remember clearly myself thinking about how my own, what felt like an individual act between me and God, downloading music without paying for it, actually has this ripple effect that impacts, by the time you stretch it out further and further, mostly every American consumer. And so a lot of our sins work that way, things that we do, that we don't do these acts in a vacuum. Enough of that. Next point. It seems to me that God is intervening on behalf of all persons involved in this story. God has Abraham's well-being in mind, and also promises made to him from the beginning, promises of land and offspring. And as a matter of fact, Abraham comes off on the other side of the story fairly well loaded with new possessions and servants, slaves, and animals, livestock, and all those things. But then also in preventing Sarah's having sex with Abimelech, God protects the promise for progeny by way of Sarah, which is the promise that was reiterated Genesis chapter 17, actually told to Sarah for the first time really in Genesis chapter 17. But then God also protects Abimelech, the Canaanite king. The Canaanites would often be at war with the Israelites, but in this story, God protects that king who innocently stumbled into this mess, albeit by way of a curse that needs lifted by Abraham's prayer. God protects Sarah by keeping her honor intact by way of Abimelech's revelation in the dream. His restoring her to her rightful place, and his bestowing of her house the material goods. These are all the ways that God protected Sarah. Everyone ends up at the end of the story elevated in some way. Even Abraham is blessed with gifts. Hamilton writes, unlike the incident in chapter 12, where it appears, or at least is hinted, that Pharaoh and Sarah had a sexual relationship, and there's debate about that, here adultery is averted before it can begin. Once again, Abraham is materially enriched, but primarily is a vindication for Sarah. His philosophy of ethics is unchanged, his being Abraham's. The end justifies the means. What's the end? Nothing must happen that will cast a cloud of uncertainty over God's promises, a great nation and seed. The means, if necessary, use Sarah as a pawn, but that is not God's view of Sarah. She is as important to God's plan as is Abraham. Abraham will do what he has to do to save Lot. God will do what he has to do to save Sarah. Conclusion, my, big overarching takeaway. In this story, God communes with and saves Abimelech, the Canaanite. In fact, Abimelech seems to have a mysterious connection with God, operating outside of God's arrangement with Abraham. So through Abimelech, God preserves and restores Sarah to her rightful place. Abraham is given an absurd amount of slack and ends up better off at the end of the story than at the beginning. All in all, I step away from the story with a deepened conviction that God is speaking to and intervening on behalf of all humanity in spite of ourselves. In spite of ourselves. Also a John Prine song. And there are my sources. I'll bring us up. And if you thought that was the last story where a man is going to pawn off his wife to get out of a jam, rest assured, son will learn it from father, and we'll have a story in the same place. Not a great time to have been a woman back then.
When I was studying this one time, they said that perhaps the gifts that were given back to Abram were because in either case, they had given a dowry to Abram for her, because that was the tradition of the time, to give a dowry for a bride.
So he'd be giving back to him what Abraham had gone with Abraham's.
Abraham was given certain things, and he gave more or less Sarai to that person, and he didn't have to give back the dowry to the person, even though Sarah was giving back. Sarah.
It's plausible. I should look into that. I did not run across that in any of the readings that I made for either one of these, that I did for either one of these stories. I don't know what the dowry practice was in that. Well, by the time Jacob and Isaac, their children, are having kids with and marrying the descendants of Lamech, there definitely is an exchange of cattle and goods and things like that, and famous
jewelry.
Where
the servant took the jewelry and the cattle. And
yeah.
So what was that you said about chosen nor?
Well, Abraham is clearly chosen to a specific purpose. And I was kind of triggered by the use of the word unchosen in the commentary. And it was the point the commentator was making was that, Fratham in the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary, was that, well, here we have the unchosen who are behaving like the morally upright person. God even says you have, you're a person with good intent. You're innocent. God, says the only reason God intervened was because God didn't want this to play out as it was going to happen, as Abimelech would die from having this break in the moral order. And so I was just like, in this story, how useful is it even to use words like chosen and unchosen, and if you just had this story alone, true, Abraham is a prophet and maintains this prophet, actually is designated this prophet status for the first time, and is the only person walking around who can pray the prayer to alleviate the curse that has fallen on Abimelech's house with all of their wombs being stopped up. But God visits Abimelech in a dream, and in this story, when you're talking about the chosen, in the broader arc of Abraham's story, God chose Abram, called him from the land of the Chaldeans, and has an overarching goal in mind. But if you were to just take this story by itself, it's not very. Who is the chosen one in this story? I mean, if you just had this story, and God, the conversation between God and the human is between God and Abimelech in this dream. And
so I guess I was thinking of that. I think it's a scripture someplace that all might come to know the glory of God, that even those that aren't chosen might come to know the glory of God.
In Romans.
And if that's the case, then Abimelech may have very well come to know about Abram's God.
Well, they were neighbors. So they would have. And the commentator said that the God that Abimelech meets in the dream, we are to know, just kind of, I guess, on an intuitive level, that it's the God of Abraham that he's talking to.
Mhm.
So,
So- Can I just
Yeah.
interject something here? Yeah.
Sure.
So I'm curious as we go along here. I know we may not take this linearly through the Hebrew Bible here, but historically there has been such a differentiation between the chosen people, the Jews, and the not chosen, and you can't just declare yourself to be Jewish. You can
right.
commit yourself to Christ and become a Christian, but you can't just declare yourself Jewish. I mean, you can convert to Judaism, but it's a much different kind of process. And so there is something about the chosen people. And so I'm curious about some of these early stories, like Melchizedek, and then this Abimelech, who seemed to speak to or be spoken to or have the spirit of God. And so the barriers of tribalism, I think that was what we called it in that earlier story, seem to have been taken down temporarily, or God has revealed himself to someone outside of the traditional lines. It just seems to kind of eat away at that basic story of the chosen. And it's interesting to me. I don't know how it's going to play out, but it's interesting to me nonetheless. Then before, because I know this is going to go someplace else, but it was in the Lego picture, and it was in my version of the story, where God says to Abimelech in the dream, "You are a dead man." I just heard some gangster refrain, "You are a dead man." It's like, oh, God's a gangster now. It was just struck me as being funny. But I have other questions too, but I'll leave that alone for right now. So anyway, I just was curious about others' response.
To be sure, in the Torah and in the longer broader history of Israel, they are the chosen people.
Mm-hmm.
They are the chosen nation to bring about salvation first for Israel. Then, in what you were quoting, I think, Sue, was in Romans, where Paul, as a Jewish man, was trying to find language to explain how those other branches would be grafted onto this tree in a way that isn't the same. They're not. It's a different kind of work than what is set aside for Israel, for Paul in Romans, but is this inclusion of the Gentiles into this bigger narrative. But when you get to this like this story in particular, it gets muddier. I mean, the broader narrative, of course, the Jewish people are the chosen ones. And this story, and I love stories like this that have to do with the people who will become the enemies of Israel, and the divisions will be very clear. By the time we get into the life of King David, the phrase "uncircumcised Philistines" will start getting thrown around, and clearly who God prefers most of the time. With some, I think a lot of the stories about Israel's demise or when they lose battles has to do with how do you reconcile our chosenness with the reality that we're often beaten or outside, or we lose the land. I don't know. That's a thread. I don't know where to chase that down, but
well, it seems as though Abraham is chosen, but he's certainly imperfect.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So why did God pick him? There, you wonder, after he keeps doing these things, that
always gives hope to me, though, particularly like in David, all the things that he went through with Uriah and all that, but yet God still, in the end, elevates him. It gives me hope.
Mm-hmm.
And just before David, you have Saul, who was also chosen, duly chosen by God through the same prophet that would anoint David. And Saul seems to be, I can't wait to get to 1st and 2nd Samuel, because in that story, you can find you have the same factors that we have in the Torah, different source material that comprise the books of First and Second Samuel, and you can find the very pro David material, but then you also find very pro Saul material, and then you see how the person who put it together crafted the narrative in a way to explain how God could choose one person, and that person could be such a colossal blunder by the time you get to chapter 10 or something.
Well, even
also,
we have Noah too, he was chosen, and then after all that goes, well, then he does his sinning too. So, there's just many people throughout the Bible that you see this.
Yeah.
I think at some place I heard, I'm not sure I'm saying it right, but it says that Abraham was blessed, but not sinless.
it's clearly.
Yeah. In other words, he was part of God's plan, and he knew what was right, but he didn't always do what was right. And guess what? That's just like all the rest of us.
That's what I'm thinking.
And in these stories where they pawn off their wives, here's the sobering thought. Most of the judgment we bring into this against Abraham comes from us. The text is ambiguous if this was appropriate behavior in given the moral framework of his day. That's just kind of one of those things where you're like, as somebody who is angry on Sarah's behalf, again, in the story today, Abraham defends himself. Abimelech says, "What were you thinking?" And he goes, "Well, here's what I was thinking." And his reasons, by my estimation, are bad reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Especially the last one where he was like, God sent me out here, and I told Sarah from the beginning, when this happens, you're going to lie for me, okay? And so there you go, Abimelech. That's why you're wrong. And but then Abimelech goes, well, and I like it. What I do like is Abimelech frames the gift giving as he's exonerating Sarah. He's not saying, all right, Abraham, you win, you're a great guy. He's saying, make no mistake about it, these gifts are to convince everyone that Sarah has done nothing wrong. And refers to Abraham as, I gave these to your brother. He refers, instead of husband, he calls him brother. He says, he elevates Sarah. So everyone actually kind of wins in this story. There's no reckoning for Abraham after this. He doesn't really face any kind of.
Well, thank goodness he doesn't do it again. It took
No.
2 times.
Yeah.
But he did learn a lesson.
Good for Sarah, I guess.
She may have had a little talk with him.
Yeah.
I don't know if it would have done any good.
Yeah.
It could be.
But then that brings me to my other question, which is Abraham prayed for healing for Abimelech, the women and the female slaves, so that they would be healed, and in particular that the closed wombs would be opened again. Well, did Sarah get healed?
Uh,
I
don't know that Sarah was sick.
She wasn't infected.
She wasn't sick. Okay, well, were they? My version didn't say they were sick. It just said their wombs were closed, and I thought that meant that they couldn't conceive. But I didn't get it that they were ill. Nowhere did it say.
Maybe sick is the wrong word for it. The commentators would speculate as to what we're supposed to think has happened to the house of Abimelech, and whatever the it is, they all seem impacted, and the end result is death. So that leads you to believe it's some sort of disease, but it's not that explicit. And whatever it is, it has something to do with childbearing, with reproduction.
Okay.
So we don't know exactly what we're supposed to think has happened to his house. We just know they can't have babies, and the end result, if it's not rectified, will be their death.
Okay.
Yeah.
I need to leave.
Okay.
I'll
Well,
see you next time.
see you
Good luck
next
with
time.
everything, Janet. Good
No,
luck.
if you need to talk about it, just give a call.
Okay.
I'm so
all right.
sorry for the circumstance. And well, that's all I got today. If you have any more questions, just email me or call me. And if we ever get too into the weeds too much, let me know. I find this all very interesting. I usually get more. I usually end up going deeper and more narrow than I mean to. I did not anticipate going through Genesis as slowly, and if it becomes laborious, then I can rethink how we do it. Because we're in chapter 20. We're actually making progress. We're not quite halfway through Genesis. By the time we're done, we will all know Genesis. I bet you better than your average churchgoer.
So we're going to be, almost 50 pages. So 20, so 30, 29. So 29 weeks divided by 4.
Well, that's if we do it chapter by chapter. Sometimes we
And that doesn't count breaks, because probably Christmas it won't happen.
right.
Maybe New Year's.
So what's next week? What do we do for next week?
Well, we're getting into Hagar territory.
Oh,
More Hagar stuff.
Poor Hagar.
I know.
I don't know. She can be mean too, though.
Well, Sarah got mad at her.
Yeah.
Birth of Isaac. We're doing 21.
okay.
But
Then 22 is a doozy.
Hagar was not respectful to her first. And that's why Sarai got mad at her.
Well, I don't know.
We'll talk about it.
We'll talk about it.
Yeah.
it.
Take care, everyone. Have a good
Okay.
week.
Yeah, you too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.